Thank you for coming. I know these evening ones are always quite hard to get to, considering the Queen's in Cambridge as well. So I'm quite sort of honoured you come to see me instead of the Queen, which is quite cool. So yeah, I'm going to talk about BIM and asset management as an enabler for digital transformation, specifically around sort of the information requirements bit, which hopefully I'll go through a bit. As in, I'm sure I probably don't need to mention too much about BIM to most of you, but BIM is Building Information Modeling, if you're not aware. It basically means object-oriented design. So if you go to back in the day where we used to do CAD, so computer-aided design, we used to kind of draw two lines, draw a bit of hash, that used to represent a wall. Now we can actually draw an object itself, which is a virtual wall. So the advantages of having that as an object is basically we could attach a lot of metadata to it, right? And the first thing we started to do, kind of 10 years ago, we started to capture cost and time. More recently, we're capturing sort of structural elements, fire ratings, all this sort of stuff, so we can do really cool stuff. Go forward a few years, it's also been seen that we can start to attach sort of operational maintenance information against some of these objects as well. The important thing to realize, at least from a UK point of view, is we have a load of standards and specifications that basically dictate how we should use BIM, both within design, within construction, operational, health and safety, and security, which is a big one at the moment, actually. And basically, it's just a load of information management processes. So the actual 3D model itself is kind of almost an afterthought. From my point of view anyway, the main thing around BIM and around some of these standards, so 1192 standards, which are turning into ISO standards, is all around the information management processes around BIM. So that is what I will say about BIM. You're in the asset management group, right? So it's kind of pointless. But as an asset management, when we kind of look at it, it involves sort of balancing the whole functions of the organizations or the different departments, all based around the performance of an asset. And importantly, to achieve those organizational objectives. So when we talk it from a sort of digital transformation and a high-level point of view, it's all about how BIM and asset management can basically help to meet those organizational objectives. When we talk about an asset, it's a thing or an element or an entity that generates some kind of value. And it's not always finance value. Actually, a lot of the time it's customer reputational value, it's environmental value. We've done a lot of work with Transport for London around what of their assets are actually the reputational assets of Transport for London, because they're having to save 320 million. And what they realized is actually their brand is actually worth a lot of money because they can actually brand out a lot of their stuff. And so things like when you see the little London Underground logos, they're cleaned 5 times a day because they want to keep their reputation very high. So they put a lot of high reputational value on those little actually logos you see, because then they license it and sell it as pencil cases to tourists. So what is sort of digital transformation? It's quite sort of an abstract thing, really. These are kind of 3 definitions from some of the literature. The first one kind of looks as digital transformation as a process. So the actual processes of the organization are done within a digital way. Whereas in the middle one is very much about analytics, computing, advanced IT. That's kind of very much around the sort of like the hardware kind of stuff. When the one at the bottom, which is kind of the one that people have sort of run with, is that digital transformation is actually more about sort of transforming the business model as a whole around a digital process. The key things, and there's a better slide that shows this actually, about what kind of makes digital transformation different than just say with like an IT strategy or something like this, is you're actually creating new value paths through doing this or changing your value paths. And fundamentally, it's not a one-off solution. You can't just kind of do it and suddenly you've done it. It's a recurring sort of process. Why do we need to do it? Our sort of industry is actually really, really bad in terms of our digital maturity. If anyone knows the Farmers Report, that basically goes through the construction efficiency and And he very famously said, we have to modernize or we'll die as an industry. We're very much at the bottom in terms of a digital maturity rating. Quite surprisingly, we see manufacturing quite low as well, because we always compare to manufacturing from construction as being really, really better than us. But when you actually look at it as a whole, actually both manufacturing and construction were actually very, very poor in terms of our digital maturity. Some of these come from the 2025, so the UK government construction strategy. And that basically says these are a few years old now, but by 2025, they wanted to deliver things sort of 50% quicker, 50% lower emissions, which is now the big one, considering 2050 now was supposed to be neutral, carbon neutral. So that's a massively growing area. 33% cheaper, as in those two kind of line up, right? The quicker you do it, the cheaper you do it, in theory. An improvement in exports means we reduce our trade gap. As in that one's, it's basically the top two that you have to worry about, and the emissions one, sorry. So that's kind of why some companies, Network Rail, Transport for London, are going through this. They got big policy from government telling them to do it. They want to be seen to be doing it. So some of the aspects of when you read some of the literature and you talk to some of the industry people, I guess, there's generally these four aspects that are unique to sort of digital transformation. It's generally based around the use of technology. That's kind of a given. There's structural change that generally will happen. That doesn't mean you sort of take a load of people from over here to over there. It means you actually change some of the processes within the organization. But it also could be moving people around. And most importantly, it's the change in value creation. So unlike an IT strategy, digital transformation has a very specific, we are doing this in order to create new value or change the value. And there's always a financial aspect, as there is in anything in the world. As in that means both the financial aspect in the sense of we must do this to save money, or we must do this in order to, or we will spend money on this in order to create new value, and therefore new money or more money. Cool. Just to underline that kind of fact, I guess, you got your corporate strategies, so your high level from asset management, that'll be your SAP, so your strategic asset management plans. You got your functional strategies, that's where your IT, human resources, financial management will sit. You got your operational strategies, whether you're Transport for London, operating a tube, or you're producing a laptop, whatever it might be. And then basically your digital strategy should stream over those two things. It's kind of critical because when you sort of look at some of these, you find that the IT department tends to own these kind of processes, and then you just get all these really technical people trying to come up with something, when actually you need to consider your operational strategy during this process. So where do I come in? I come in by, so we've done this very simple flow like this, and what we're interested in is within that BIM and asset management bit. But we kind of look at, so Transport for London is kind of a case study we've worked on, as well as estate management that managed all of the buildings within the university. And we kind of look at the high-level asset management stuff in terms of the strategies and objectives. We use some of the BIM frameworks that's in 1192 around information requirements, which I'll go into in a minute. And what we see is there's actually a direct link between those sort of elements within the digital transformation space that actually links to the BIM space. So we can actually use some of those BIM elements in order to support our digital transformation. I really like this slide. I can never reference it because there's just so many of it. I'm sure you've seen it before. But just to state, when we're talking about information requirements, we're not actually talking about data. We're talking about creating meaning of the data. So it's the actual information requirement itself. And if we produce good information requirements, we put them together, we then create knowledge, and then hopefully we'll use that knowledge for wisdom. So if we get those information requirements right, we can actually do really good wisdom from that knowledge. So that's what we're looking at. One thing to note, the information requirements are actually very complex. So you look at some of the literature, it goes all the way back to the 1960s when information management systems were coming out, and they realized, actually, when you're developing bits of software, we need to understand the information requirements of that software. And actually, it's very complex. You can't simply go and ask someone exactly what information you require. Often they give you biased points of views, and they don't give the information they actually need. Okay? So those are just some snapshots from the 1192 stuff that actually tells you it's quite complex. I'll go quickly through this. This is from 1192 part 3, and this basically says as part of the BIM information management stuff, an organization shall develop organizational information requirements, OIRs, and they then generate asset information requirements. But what you find happens is it actually comes from the bottom up. So actually you're getting technical information requirements. You're not getting organizational information requirements. And there's sort of two reasons for this. There's one, because OIRs are actually quite complex to produce, and we don't really have a methodology or a framework that helps us to do them within an asset management point of view. But also, the jump from an OIR to an AIR is quite a big leap. When you're talking about high-level information requirements, strategic, and then you go all the way down to a gas heater boiler system, they don't really align. So how can we actually create that alignment? So we've developed this framework that we're going through at the moment, which is basically, we use a lot of the good stuff in 55,000. You're on asset management and strategies, objectives. We actually use them to develop the OIRs. From that, we create this thing in the middle called functional information requirements. So that kind of tries to bridge the gap between the asset information requirements. So that looks at an asset from the functional output that actually provides. So instead of looking at an asset from a gas sort of heating, gas sort of radiator, we actually look at it from the function of heating, and we develop information requirements from that function. What you find is it's really easy because Transport for London have around 2,000 different asset systems. They've only got about 30 different functions. So instead of looking at 2,000 asset information requirements, we look at 20 functional information requirements. And that is much more related to the OIRs. Right. I'm not going to go through all of this because I'm running out of time, I'm afraid. But we've got this 7-step process. It's in the paper. It basically says we identify organizational requirements, we do OIRs, FARs, AIRs, and whatnot. Just an example around that sort of value chain stuff. You can't really see it. But this was an example of Transport for London, where actually they have around 110 different objectives or different new value paths that they want to create in the next few years, which is a lot. But what you find is if you actually look through some of this documentation, it's actually quite easy to sort of extract some of these value paths. And this in itself is quite an interesting task. For such a big organization, they've never had all of these sort of things in one spot because it's through 20 different kinds of documents. In terms of the organizational information requirements, we look at those high-level objectives. This one's to reduce cost by 5%. We developed some critical success factors, which is from IBM back in the 80s. That basically says, what are the factors that will make me successful in meeting this objective? Then we develop plain language questions, which are part of the BIM standards. That say, what questions do you ask around that factor? And then your answer gives you your information requirement. So it's actually quite simple, complex. The answer you get from those questions actually give you your information requirements on the left there. That turns into your OIR. This was just to say around that functional information requirements bit. So when you actually look at your assets, you've got functional output and asset systems. The way we do it is we classify by the functional output. That means we can develop those functional information requirements. So these are the functional information requirements, sorry. So we have got our new value paths, which we've extracted from the documents. We've developed our OIRs. And then from that, we capture information. And we tend to capture it by these categories of managerial, technical, and financial, because that helps us to structure the people we're talking to. So if we want to know financial information requirements, we can speak to the finance team or the technical team. Managerial just tends to be your sort of asset IDs and whatnot. One thing we find really helpful when we're doing asset information requirements, so the next level down, is we actually do what's called an information delivery manual, which again is quite simple. It's just a flow chart. So we tend, this is just an example of an asset that has failed. and kind of the process it goes through within the organisation. And what you do here is you actually capture those bits of exchange of information. And what that does, it allows you to capture the more technical information from people on the ground by structuring like this. So by doing this kind of workshop, we're actually able to develop asset information requirements. Just to show you how that kind of exists in a sort of a linear process, our objectives are our new value paths, our OIRs, do our functions. From our functions, we get different asset systems. So there's a whole linear sort of process going on. From that, when we do these sort of when we do these kind of asset classification bits, we tend to develop them within UML models. So what's really good there is that we can use that UML model to then develop an asset information model. So you're actually starting to have an alignment between some of the BIM stuff and some of the asset information stuff. What's critical there is when someone like Transport for London do some capital works, so they actually do a bit of work, they develop a BIM model. If they classify it in this way, in the BIM model, we're actually able to directly import that into their asset management system. So you're actually able to go from your BIM into your asset management system, simply based on that classification process, because that's how we structure the model. I was supposed to say, I've only got like half a minute left, I'll be quick. We use that UML to develop just a very simple model there that goes into the database. Using the digital twin stuff that VV spoke about before, we've actually classified the BIM model for the IFM building, and what you're able to do then is using the IFC model, we're actually able to extract certain components from that BIM model and actually insert that into the database that we've created there. So we're actually got a direct link from the BIM model going into the asset information model. That's just a program we've done it that reads in the IFC, shoots it off to a SQL database. I won't go through that. So yeah, that's basically it. So we're able to use some of the BIM processes, some of that digital model, the information requirements we've done. We're actually able to put it all together and sort of extract information from the BIM model, the information requirements we've developed for Transport for London, and actually produce an asset information model that's from them. That supports a digital time, and that's me, and that's some papers.